shorter discourse on ways of undertaking things. This is sutta number 45 in the Middle Length Discourses, starting on page 405. Okay, so the title, Chula just means smaller or shorter, and Dhammas can have various meanings. Venerable Nyanamoli just used the most general meaning of things, and samadana means to take up or to undertake. And so these are actually describing 4 ways of conduct. And in these 2 suttas, this one and the following one, you get a very clear example of how the Buddha, when laying out his teaching, he always uses a very systematic framework, laying out the different possibilities and then showing the different consequences to which the different possibilities lead. Okay, so here he opens the discourse by saying that there are 4 ways of undertaking things, or we say 4 modes of conduct, 4 ways of behaving, 4 ways of undertaking action in the world. Okay, so the 4 are different permutations, basically, of 2 ideas. So whether a course of action, one idea is whether a course of action is pleasant or painful. The other idea is whether its fruits or consequences are pleasant or painful. So we could say the basic framework is I'm failing my IQ test here. Okay. Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm having trouble figuring this out. Well, maybe don't be diagrams. I should have diagrammed it beforehand. So one is the feeling that accompanies the course of action here and now as one is undertaking that action, and the other is the long-term consequence of that action, whether it's pleasant or painful. And so when you take these 2 principles, you get 4 types of ways of undertaking things. One is the way of undertaking things that's pleasant now and ripens in the future as pain. then the way of undertaking things that is painful now and ripens in the future as pain. So first, the Buddha takes the two courses that have painful consequences. One is pleasant as one is performing it. The other is painful as one is performing it. But what unifies them is that both issue in future suffering. Then there are the two ways of behavior that issue in future pleasure or happiness. One of these is painful now, and the other is pleasant now. So a painful course and a pleasant course that issue in future happiness. Think away with left diagram. Perhaps one can do it as a box. But it's better this way. Stay stuck. Is that what you had? Okay, so now the Buddha says, he begins now by explaining what they are. So here he says, what is the way of undertaking things that is pleasant now and ripens in the future as pain? And here he is referring to certain schools of thought or modes of practice that were current during the period in which he lived. And so he says that there are certain recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that there is no harm in sensual pleasures. In other words, they encourage free indulgence in sensual pleasures. And so they're a kind of, maybe you call them hedonists. So they say, enjoy as much sensual pleasure as you can, because there's no harm from them. There's no danger in them, no drawbacks in them. So this was a course of action that the Buddha himself had experienced before his renunciation. When he was a prince, he would have been freely able to enjoy all of the worldly pleasures of life, and found that they didn't lead to any kind of wisdom or liberation. Okay, so these ascetics and Brahmins who hold this doctrine, they take to gulping down sensual pleasures. The Pali word actually means that they indulge this thirst for sensual pleasures, and they divert themselves with women wanderers who wear their hair bound in a top knot. It seems that already in the Buddha's time there was probably a small group of women who had left the household life to take up a kind of life of ascetics, supposedly ascetics or wanderers, and they would attach themselves to groups of male wanderers. When darkness would fall, they would have a bit of fun in the woods. And so these ascetics and Brahmins say, that there are some ascetics and Brahmins who speak about abandoning or renouncing sensual pleasures, and they describe the full understanding or the overcoming of sensual pleasures. And so they say, what harm do these good recluses and Brahmins see in sensual pleasures? And then they continue and they say, pleasant is the touch of this woman wanderer's tender, soft, downy arm. And so they take to gulping down sensual pleasures. Now, because they're leading supposedly a life of renunciation, they should be committed to a life of brahmacharya, that is a life of celibacy. And yet, even though they're displaying themselves to the public as renunciants, and they're being supported by the people, by the public, with the expectation that they're living lives of renunciation, lives of celibacy, but still they are indulging in worldly sensual pleasures. And because of this, it seems that they are deceiving people and supporting themselves with the deceit by deceiving people. And so this is considered within the context of the Indian society a kind of deception. Maybe if we were to take a counterpart, maybe I'll leave the imagination to you, what would be like a counterpart in contemporary American society in the religious scene?
Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's a bit of a strong example, but it is true. Yeah. The Catholic priest, yeah. Oh, this is true about some of the Hindu teachers. Yeah, it's actually quite true. Yeah.
And what about what's-his-face? He was Pema Chodron's teacher. He was really bad. I can't remember his name.
He didn't make any claim to be a celibate. In fact, I think he was at least, would give him credit that he was quite open about what he was doing. No, I don't know what the consequences of his action would be. But I'm thinking not so much, or not necessarily about sexual enjoyment, but there are other preachers and teachers who make other claims and then behave quite differently.
Oh, televangelism.
Exactly, that's what I'm thinking of. Who, Christian preachers who preach the gospel and tell their followers that one should be living according to the teachings of Christ, living a life of simplicity. But they themselves live quite luxuriously. And actually, many of these preachers even turn the teaching of Jesus around, and they have they call it the gospel of prosperity. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
That you should try to get as wealthy as possible because that's a sign that you will be one of the chosen, one of the elect. If you are prosperous, you belong to the elect. And then, of course, you have to donate a certain percentage of your earnings to the church. And so they will have big mega churches, and they will drive around in, it used to be Cadillacs, but I don't hear people talking boastfully about Cadillacs anymore.
Mercedes. BMW.
BMW.
Hummers.
What's that?
They don't make them anymore.
Hummers.
Oh, they've been out of commission for a year.
Do civilians drive Hummers? I thought that was the military.
They did.
Oh. and then also there are some of these homophobic preachers, who say, oh, the gay people, the lesbians, they're all going to hell, God hates them. And then about 6 months ago, there was in the Miami airport, somebody took a flash picture of one of these preachers. Maybe he wasn't a preacher, but he was the head of one of these Council for Family Values men, who was most vociferously opposed to homosexuality. And there he is at the airport with a handsome young man that he took to vacation in the Bahamas, supposedly on the ground, that he just came out from the hospital and he needs somebody to carry his luggage.
Yeah, but he's not religious.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, he did good he wasn't a preacher, he was a politician. And also he did good work. He should still be a governor. If he was still a governor, perhaps there would have been more severe pressure on Wall Street. Okay, so they do this, they freely indulge in sensual pleasure, and then the text says, after death, they reappear in a state of deprivation in an unhappy destination, one of the bad destinations, in perdition, that's the lower world, even in hell, and there they feel painful, racking, piercing feelings. And then they say, this is the future fear or the future danger that those good recluses and Brahmins saw in sensual pleasures when they spoke of abandoning sensual pleasures. For it is by reason of sensual pleasures, owing to sensual pleasures, that we are now feeling painful, racking, piercing feelings. What do you think of this? Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts about that?
Karma?
I mean, it's supposed to be the result of karma.
How does the Buddha know this? Is this from his knowledge of the future?
Well, supposedly he would be able to see, with the divine eye, what happens to them after death. Does it seem fully justifiable for what they're doing? To be reborn in hell?
Maybe not so much what they're doing, but
Yeah.
how they're presenting themselves. The consequence of that is suffering.
Well, and even the Buddha was able to turn his life around, right?
Yeah.
There's always a choice.
Yeah.
It's more about the deceit.
Maybe so, yeah. But I have to say, from my point of view, it seems a little, well, I'd say more than a little, it seems somewhat an extreme consequence of an action like that. It's quite a different case if you have, say, a Catholic priest who is seducing and molesting a young boy, who's, maybe 10, 12, 13-year-old boy, who's not able to judge for himself and who will just accept the authority of the priest and do whatever he says. Maybe the priest is even threatening him with divine retribution if he doesn't yield to the priest's desires. But in the case of an ascetic who indulges with a mature woman, to say that he's going to be reborn, that he will be reborn in hell as a consequence of that, to me it seems rather strong. I could say an unhappy rebirth, but a rebirth in hell? Normally I would reserve the hell for those who really inflict suffering on others. not that I want to sort of second guess the Buddha, but just using sort of my own intuitive sense of what kind of action should lead to what kind of consequence.
But there's a lot of that in the Pali Canon of really extreme things. Supposedly, the Venerable Ananda, in one of his many past lives, was naughty and got stuck in hell for, innumerable kalpas. And, I'll look it up on Access to Insight. I remember reading that.
Was it Ananda or Mahamoggallana?
No, it was Ananda.
Oh, this I don't remember.
I'll have to look it up. I think I read it on Access to Insight. But there's a lot of examples of extreme you're going to hellness.
Yeah, I have to say that's the case.
Actors might go to hell,
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I guess two things come to mind. I mean, first, I know it's not meant this way, but when I read something like this...
Maybe take the microphone.
When I read something like this, even though I know it's probably not intended this way, I mean, I see it on a mundane level of if you overindulge in anything, you're going to have painful consequences. If you drink too much, you're going to wake up with a hangover. If you eat too much, you're going to be in pain, etc. So on that level, you're kind of moment to moment reborn in hell, certainly.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, I think you just said something interesting about that you would reserve the hell levels for people who have done harm to others.
Especially,
But are we ourselves included among others? I mean, if you do severe harm to yourself, is that equally worthy of a rebirth in hell? So, I mean, if you're, punishing your body with excessive behaviors, punishing your mind with excessive vile thoughts or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. In fact, the next course will be those who inflict pain upon themselves, by taking up the ascetic practices. And the text is going to assign them to hell too. But I don't think it doesn't seem likely that the karmic cause for that rebirth in hell is undertaking the ascetic practices. Because the Buddha himself according to the text, had undertaken those same ascetic practices. And there's some things in the text I have to say I find difficult to understand or to make sense out of. Yes,
are these things... Is this meant to be literal, or just keep society in some sort of check?
The way it's stated, if you just take the text on the surface, it seems to be literal, because it says, on the dissolution of the body after death. But it can be that there's sort of an underlying purpose or agenda is to keep other ascetics and maybe his own monks to keep them in check.
I think it's more spreading of the wrong will instead of indulging the essential person.
Actually, that's a good point. He said that the main point is rather spreading the wrong view. So propagating the view, that's actually could be a very good point. That the point, the deed that brings about strong negative karma is propagating the view to others that there's no harm in sensual pleasures. Not the fact simply that he's stroking the arm of the woman ascetic with the top knot on her head. But propagating this view, that could be, that seems to be the point there. Anyway, let us go on. Okay, now the text gives a simile for this. It's a very vivid simile. And I've seen this myself actually in Sri Lanka, not with deities, but with trees. Okay, creepers and trees. Suppose that in the last month of the hot season, a malava creeper pod burst open, and then a malava creeper seed fell at the foot of a sal tree. Sal tree is a very large strong, majestic tree that grows in South Asia. Okay, then a deity living in the tree became frightened by this, but the deity's friends and companions, kinsmen and relatives, there are other types of deities, came around and they said to him, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. Perhaps a peacock will swallow this Malava creeper, or a wild animal will eat it, or a forest fire will burn it, and so on and so on. And it might not even be fertile. Okay, but none of this happens, and then the rain falls, and the seed of the creeper gets moistened, and then the creeper sprouts and starts growing. It's a soft, tender, soft, downy tendril. Starts wrapping itself around the sal tree. Then the deity living in the tree says, what future fear did my friends and companions and so on see in that Malava creeper seed when they gathered and reassured me? This Malava creeper, the tendril is very soft and pleasant. Okay, but the creeper wraps itself around the salva tree and makes a canopy over it. Then it drapes a curtain all around the tree, and then it splits the main branches of the tree. And then maybe the tree comes toppling down. And so then the deity who is living in that tree realizes, so this is the future danger that they saw in the Malava creeper seed. Because of that Malava creeper seed, I'm now experiencing painful, racking, piercing feelings. And what I've seen in jungles in Sri Lanka, there are these kinds of creepers that grow up, very small, and they just look like an ordinary weed, but they grow next to a tree. Sometimes they grow within the fork of the tree in the branches. Then they wrap themselves around the trunk of the tree. They'll send down roots into the ground, and then that creeper will start growing and become bigger and bigger, stronger and stronger, until sometimes it will suck up all of the nutrition out of the tree, and the host tree will die. And sometimes it will become so strong, the creeper, that it will actually split the tree, and the tree comes falling down dead. Okay, so this illustrates the case of these ascetics and Brahmins who indulge in the sensual pleasure. Okay, next comes the way of undertaking things that's painful now and ripens in the future as pain. Okay, so here we have the case of an ascetic who goes naked, rejecting any kind of the ordinary conventions of everyday life. He doesn't use any utensils when he eats, but he licks his hands. He doesn't wash the hands. Actually, in India, everybody uses the hands for eating. Nobody uses spoons, forks, except people who have come under the influence of the British empirical, the British Empire. But ordinary people will use their hands for eating, but they'll always have bowls of water at the end of the meal, then they wash their hands. Okay, then the text will enumerate a whole variety of ascetic practices, like reducing the intake of food till one is just eating a few grains of rice per day, sleeping on beds of thorns, exposing oneself to the heat of the sun, to the cold of the nights, and so on. And so in this way he dwells, pursuing the practice of tormenting and mortifying the body. And then on the dissolution of the body after death, he is reborn in a state of misery, an unhappy destination in the lower world, in hell. So that's the way of undertaking things that's painful now and ripens in the future as pain. Again, I have to say, seems to me a bit strong for somebody who might have been leading a sincere renunciate life, maybe seeking enlightenment and liberation. It's just that he has wrong guidance, and so he thinks that the way to enlightenment is through engaging in these ascetic practices. And even in India today, there are ascetics who engage in similar practices. I remember back 1975 when I was in India, I think we were either coming back from Lumbini, still on the Indian side of the border, or going into Lumbini. I think it was before we reached Lumbini. We were in this little town to catch the bus that was going right to the Nepal border. And there came an ascetic. If I remember, he was naked and walking on all fours and stopping in front of the shops, waiting for people to throw him food, just like he was a dog. And then I'd already read at this point the Majjhima Nikaya, and I thought, wow, this is just like it's called the dog duty ascetic, described in Sutta number 57 of the Majjhima Nikaya. I thought, wow, 2,500 years, and it's still going on today. I didn't follow that dog ascetic to find out where he's going to be reborn. He seemed to be a bit older than myself, so it's likely that he's not alive anymore. I don't have any idea where he's been reborn, though. Okay, so that's the way of undertaking things that's painful now because of the ascetic practices and ripens in the future as pain. I would certainly say that a practice like that is not likely to bring a pleasant result, even though the idea of a rebirth in hell seems to be too severe for my personal judgment. Okay, what is the way of undertaking things that is painful now and ripens in the future as pleasure? Okay, here somebody by nature, just by the character of that person, has strong lust, strong raga or passions, and he constantly experiences pain and grief or pain and misery born of lust. By nature he has strong hatred, again by nature strong delusion, and he constantly experiences pain and grief born of delusion. And yet, while experiencing this pain and grief, even while weeping and shedding tears, he leads the perfect and pure holy life. Then on the dissolution of the body after death, he is reborn in a happy realm, even in the heavenly world. So this is called the way of undertaking things that is painful now and ripens in the future as pleasure. And so sometimes people think that everybody who leads the monastic life is in some way has a very pure, noble, well-developed character. But many people who still have strong defilements, but their wisdom eye is open to some extent, and so when they hear the Dhamma, they can be so inspired by it that they decide to go forth and to lead the life of renunciation as a monk or a nun. And yet these passions, because one becomes a monastic, doesn't mean that the passions immediately vanish. But even while practicing very diligently, very sincerely, there will be times when these defilements or passions come surging to the surface, so strongly that the person might think, I can't withstand them anymore. I'll give up the monastic life and return to the household life. And this happens with a great number of those who go forth. Like in a country like Sri Lanka, it's quite typical for young boys, when they're 12, 13, they have a kind of romantic image of the monastic life, or it used to be a tradition, to some extent it still is, in devout Buddhist families, when they have a large family with several sons, they will take one of the sons and they say to offer him to the triple gem, to the Culadhammasamadana, which means to give him to the monastery to become ordained as a monk. And so if the young boy, at the age of 12, 13, he has these romantic images, romantic ideas of the renunciate life. He thinks, I'm going to be sitting in deep meditation. By the time I'm 17 or 18, I'm going to be a stream enterer, once returner, non-returner. By the time I'm 21, I'll be an arahat. And then he goes walking on alms round through the streets, very calm, self-controlled, restrained, very mindful, and people say, oh, look at the young monk, bow to him, very impressed. When he gets to be 16, 16 or 17 years old, the hormones start gushing through the body, and then, well, maybe not at once, maybe not an arahat in this life, but certainly a stream enterer. By the time he's 18, he's struggling to remain. By the time he's 19, he can't take it anymore. And when he gets to be 20, he comes to his teacher and says, Bhante, I want to give up the monk's life and return to the home life. There are many cases like that. I mean, in Sri Lanka, I would say that of the young boys in the monastery who are in their teens, by the time they get to be 30 years old, maybe only a third of them will still be monks. That's the way it is. And even the elder monks know that's the case. But it's like, if we're going to keep the Sangha going, we have to take our chances. We have to ordain 100 young boys so that we can have 30 of them still monks 20 years later or 15 years later. If we limit our number to 15, then 30 years later, 15 years later, we're going to have only 5 boys left. But there are others who, whether they're ordained when they're youngsters or ordained when they're in full adolescence or even as young men, young women, when the passions come up like this, strongly coursing through the mind, they make the effort to restrain them, even with difficulty, thinking that I've pledged my life to follow this path, so despite the difficulties, I'm going to continue with this training. And so even though they have to endure a lot of pain and suffering now, actually if they continue like this over time, the passions will weaken to the point where they develop calm and equanimity. And then eventually, as a result of persisting in the training, they're creating a lot of wholesome karma that will bring a happy rebirth in the future, even if they don't reach any of the stages of realization. Okay, then the fourth way of undertaking things, or the fourth way of practice or training, is the one that's pleasant now and ripens in the future as pleasure or happiness. Okay, here we have the case of somebody who by nature is not strongly prone to lust, hatred, and delusion. and to the contrary, is able to fairly easily enter and dwell in the 4 jhanas. The text doesn't speak about him going further beyond the jhanas to the development of insight, so it's a mundane teaching. But if he is able to enter and dwell in the jhanas, then with the breakup of the body after death, then he will be reborn in a happy destination, even in the heavenly world. And both the one who practices with pain and difficulty and the one who practices with pleasure and with joy, both of them are capable of going beyond a happy rebirth to reach the stages of enlightenment and liberation, even though that's not mentioned explicitly in the sutta. Okay, any questions or comments on these 4 ways of undertaking things?
So looking at it globally and the consequences of that lead to possibly hell, it seems like it says unhappy destination, then perdition, or maybe even hell. So it's like giving that whole range.
Yeah, actually that is true.
If you consider that these are the 4 ways of acting, somebody's going to end up in hell. There's going to be someone in one of those 2.
Yeah, that's also a good point. It's not necessarily the case that they're going to wind up in hell.
And these particular ones are just an example, not necessarily all from pleasure and
So there are actually several unhappy destinations or bad destinations. It's called the animal realm. What is called the pages, the realm of, I call them the afflicted spirits. Others call them the hungry ghosts. And then the lowest is the hell realm. And then there are probably other unhappy destinations too. Maybe yakshas, bhutas, which are the fierce spirits, asuras, the jealous deities.
Yeah, but they're devas.
Excuse me?
Asuras are devas.
We had a little discussion about this last week.
They're not hell beings.
No. But sometimes they class within the unhappy destinations. So it's a little paradoxical. We went over this last week. That they're shown almost...
And Suja is married, according to the text, to what's-his-face.
That's actually a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Asura maiden is married to Sutta, the king of the Devas.
And Vepachiti is his father-in-law. Vepachiti is his father-in-law.
Yeah.
King of the Ajuras.
Well, you seem to have quite a good knowledge of these family relationships. You were a, what do they call this? The one who arranges marriages? Yenta.
No, Yenta's a busybody. That's not the right word. That's not the word.
Yenta is the woman.
Yenta's a busybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the right word.
Any other comments or?
I was just wondering, I read about this scholar, Richard Gombrich, and he has this view that whenever he comes across a sutta where he thinks that it's not realistic or doesn't like it, he basically says the systematizers probably just threw that in. So whenever I read the suttas now, I kind of have that in the back of my mind. Do you think that should I be doing that? Should I say if I read sutta and it seems weird, should I be the Buddha probably didn't say that. Maybe the compilers who put together the suttas.
So, you see, the problem is that we don't have any direct access to the word of the Buddha apart from compilations. So sometimes we could assess. Let's say all we could do is develop a probability chart, saying that there's a strong probability that this was spoken by the Buddha. If we find contradictions between one statement and a lot of other statements, then it seems probable that this was not, or improbable that this was actually spoken by the Buddha. So I think that we have to be a little cautious about making quick generalizations as to what is the work of the systematizers or the compilers and what was actually spoken by the Buddha.
Like in this case, you think that maybe the systematizers had any changes?
Yeah. I'm really not able to say. Sometimes I find Gambara's comments quite insightful. Sometimes he goes to an extreme. You know, I've actually had a correspondence with. This is being recorded. I wonder.
It's on the internet, Bhante. I've read that correspondence.
Okay, good. Doesn't matter if he sees it. I had a correspondence with him back in the late 1990s about, in the book that he wrote, How Buddhism Began. He made this claim that the Brahma Viharas were just a metaphorical expression for the achievement of nirvana. Then I compiled. Okay, then I wrote a book review of that book, and I criticized him on that point. Then I saw the text of a lecture that he gave in England. It was published in a Buddhist journal, saying that there's a very high-bound traditionalist American monk in Sri Lanka who questioned me on this point, but I still maintain that the Brahma Viharas are a metaphor for nirvana. Then I wrote to him, and I compiled a whole bunch of texts coming from the Nikayas in which the Buddha speaks about attaining the Brahma Viharas in earlier lives and saying this was excellent, this was sublime, but this was not the way to, this was not the way to disenchantment, to dispassion, to enlightenment, to nirvana. But now I am teaching this Noble Eightfold Path. So I compiled like about 10 texts and I sent it to him. I never got a reply from him. But then I took a look, I don't have a copy of it, but I took a look at his more recent book called What the Buddha Thought. And I saw that he's still making the same claim. I'll have to track him down. Repeat. I still have that email.
I thought it sounded ridiculous too. We were studying like he was saying, to think that the Brahma Viharas are not enlightenment, it's like, I think he said this violence to the text.
Do violence to the text. Well, you see, they weren't misleading him, but they were speaking about, in a way they were, but they saw that there's some danger or fear, and so they were trying to tell him, don't be afraid. And so it seems that he was puzzled, what is the fear? But to make better sense out of it, they should have been telling him, this is fearful, this is dangerous, you should move to another tree. And then he should have said, no, there's nothing to be afraid of, it's just a little seed fell to the ground.
Who was supposed to have recorded all of these things? Who was supposed to have heard this and then written it down?
Yeah. Well, actually, you see, the texts were transmitted orally for 300, 400 years. According to the traditional account, the Buddha had his personal attendant was a monk named Ananda. And so Ananda, it said, had an excellent memory. And so he would always follow the Buddha along, and he would memorize all of the Buddha's discourses whenever the Buddha gave them. And if he missed any discourses, he would go to the monks who heard them, learn them, and then preserve them in memory. And so after the Buddha passed away, 3 months after he passed away, the leading monks in the order, they held a council in the city of Rajagaha, and they had Ananda recite all of the suttas that he had remembered, and then they all memorized them under Ananda, breaking up into different companies, specializing in different groups of texts, and then they would train their disciples to memorize them. And so this way the teachings were transmitted for 300, 400 years, till finally in the 1st century BC they were written down in Sri Lanka. This is, I would say, partly legendary, or at least it's not to be taken absolutely literally, because there are different early Buddhist schools who basically who had transmitted what is basically the same corpus of texts. But there were variations in readings, variations in orders, variations in arrangements between the texts in the different Buddhist schools. The teachings are fundamentally all the same. And sometimes there are remarkable correspondences between schools that have been geographically separated by wide distances. But there are differences in arrangements and so on which sort of belie the claim that the texts were transmitted faithfully, absolutely as spoken, over 300, 400 years.
What's like the New Testament?
Oh, it's a very different situation with the New Testament. Because the New Testament, we have 3 synoptic gospels which are very different from one another, and which very clearly show the particular, let's say, interests of the group that was charged with them, significant differences in temporal sequences, whereas with the Buddhist text there's remarkable agreement in the temporal sequence of events, in the basic teaching, sometimes verbal agreements between a text that's come down over hundreds of years, preserved in Chinese translation coming from northwest India, and a text preserved in Sri Lanka. That is supposed to be Ananda stating that this is what he heard at the first council. Again, this is a little bit not completely trustworthy because many later texts appear, and to give them all the kind of imprimatur of authenticity, they always begin with the words, "Thus have I heard."
Recently, I was reading about the practices of Benedictine monks in the early period of that order, and monks were supposedly allowed to read 1 book per year.
Only.
And they have a form of reading they call Lectio Divina, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, rather than reading these scriptures as a catechism, that the way to approach it is to read it in that sense of Lectio Divina. That is to say, allow it to act on you, and really go deeply into it, and not take it as as something literal or as a catechism that you have to believe every point of it. But allow it to go
with meanings that are sort of implicit and that will come out through reflection and meditation.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe so, but it seems that the text isn't, as it presents itself, is intended to be taken literally. But I still have to say I find some problem taking it very literally, at least with some of the claims. It's not that I have any problem with the idea of rebirth itself. I'm not in any way, like some of you might know Stephen Batchelor, who just rejects the idea of rebirth. He says that this was just part of the Indian cultural baggage that the Buddha was taking on. And now that Buddhism comes to the West, we have to drop this Indian cultural baggage. I mean, I accept the teachings of rebirth and karma, the different realms of existence, more or less, as they come down in the text. But sometimes claims seem to be a little strong. Let me see, there's a question coming from the internet. The Buddhist view regarding the gospel of prosperity. Prosperity is good karma. I think he means the fruit of good karma. Poverty is the fruit of bad karma. Moderation, simplicity, even an extremely frugal lifestyle is a virtue, but not self-mortification. Yeah, these are good points. So again, a little problem would come up here if one takes the Buddhist doctrine of karma and its results very literally and as a very strict law. So prosperity is the fruit of good karma, and that one leads a life of moderation, simplicity, but one doesn't have obsessive needs for material or hedonistic enjoyment. And so that is a virtue and is creating wholesome karma. Then as a result of that wholesome karma, one gets reborn into prosperity, and then one gets burdened with all of the luxuries, comforts, and conveniences that one gave up to live a life of simplicity and moderation. And if one still preserves in the mind that mental formation of moderation and simplicity, then one can dwell amongst the luxuries, detached from them, and perhaps simplify one's lifestyle. But if that seed of self-indulgence is still strong in the mind, then one gets reborn into the life of luxury, comfort, and convenience. One might think, to hell with this moderation and simplicity. That's for simple-minded suckers. I'm going to enjoy myself now. Anyway, this taken up on its own merits is a good point. These are two people. Okay, one person has a comment. Suffering can bring about a high degree of spiritual awareness and appreciation. Yes, of course, this is actually true. If one gets reborn under very favorable conditions, living a life of comfort, convenience, luxury, very often one could just be sort of seduced or swept away by all of those conveniences and doesn't experience any kind of spur to renunciation, towards effort, towards liberation. But it's when one experiences suffering, not really debilitating, oppressive suffering, but a moderate degree of suffering, that one comes to understand, we say, the suffering that is always underlying our existence from moment to moment. And so suffering is the spur to faith, to practice, to liberation. Okay, another person says, it seems that the Buddhists should not deliberately seek pain and suffering, but if suffering is a result of past karma, one should deal with it calmly, reflect on it, and learn the lesson with equanimity. Yes, good comment. In the Bible, God always favors the poor, so I don't know. Is there more to that question?
Seems like he knows who you are. It's the last statement he has. Seems like he knows who you are.
God knows who the person is.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a way, say the biblical God is doing service, or in Buddhism, the law of karma, that you can't perceive God, but according to Christianity, and the Buddhists would say, one can't perceive the law of karma. So one gets the results that accord with one's actions, with one's inner mental state, not with one's external sort of hypocritical displays of piety. Any further comments? Questions? I said I would take on 2 suttas today.
I'm confused because Buddhism says that the sense gates are the spur of consciousness and awareness. Without sight, you have no idea.
Better that you take the microphone so everybody can hear.
The consciousness depends on the 5 sense gates and the mind, but after the dissolution of the body, what is there to be sensing these other realms?
Okay, that's a good question, but I'm just trying to think whether we're going to have a sutta that will bring up that question, because it requires a more detailed answer. But I did actually deal with that question.
Yeah.
Who's taking you to Argentina, to Europe, to the Bahamas? Even if you go to these far-off places, we're on the internet. But if you look, I think I did, was it in this class that I did Sutta number 38?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look in Sutta, the backlog of recordings on, it will be on Yu Rong's website, and also on the Tuan Yin, the Bao's website, Buddhist Association of the United States. The past recordings from the Majjhima Nikaya Sutta, the lectures on Sutta number 38. I dealt with that, it isn't true. Okay, I'm just going to go through like a quick outline of Sutta number 46. Just the main points. I can't deal with it at length. Okay, we come to chapter, or section 2. So, for the most part, beings, here we can understand people, have the wish that they would like undesirable things to diminish and desirable and agreeable things to increase for them. But even though they have this wish, for the most part, disagreeable things increase for them and agreeable things diminish. So this is like, sometimes it can be stated most succinctly that even though people yearn to be free of suffering and yearn to find happiness, but for the most part they're constantly meeting with suffering, and real happiness proves to be very evasive. And so then the Buddha asks, what is the reason for this? The monks say, you explain, you're the teacher. And so the Buddha then takes first the case of the ordinary person, the uninstructed worldly person, who doesn't know what things should be cultivated and what things should not be cultivated. And so because he doesn't understand this, he cultivates the things that should not be cultivated and does not cultivate the things that should be cultivated. In other words, he doesn't follow the right and wrong courses of behavior, and so he does those things, behaves in those ways that produce suffering, and doesn't undertake those types of action that lead to happiness. In contrast, the wise, instructed, noble disciple knows what things should be cultivated and what things should not be cultivated, and so he cultivates the things that should be cultivated and doesn't cultivate the things that should not be cultivated. And he does not cultivate those things that shouldn't be cultivated. As a result of this, then the undesirable things diminish for him and the desirable things increase. Okay, then the Buddha introduces the 4 ways of undertaking things. In their combinations, permutations, they're the same as in the previous sutta, but they'll be elaborated differently. But rather than explain them explicitly, the Buddha just fills in by saying that the ignorant person who doesn't understand all of these distinctions, he cultivates the way that is painful now and ripens in pain, and he cultivates the way that is pleasant now and ripens in pain. And because he cultivates these 2 ways, then the undesirable things arise for him. The reason is because he doesn't see and doesn't understand. Okay, now taking together paragraphs 8 and 9. Okay, again, it's the ignorant, deluded person, doesn't know the way of undertaking things that's painful now and that's pleasant now, but that ripen in happiness in the future. So since he doesn't have that understanding, he doesn't undertake those 2 courses, the way that's painful now, the way that's pleasant now, which both ripen in future pleasure or happiness. In contrast, the wise person understands all of these distinctions, and so whether a course of action is painful now or pleasant now, if it ripens in future pain, he'll avoid it. Whether it's painful now or pleasant now, if it will ripen in future happiness, he will undertake that way of action. And so this is because this person is wise and has ripe understanding. Okay, then the Buddha explains the 4 ways a little differently from in number 45. First, the way that's painful now and ripens in the future is pain. Here, somebody with pain and with suffering violates the 10 courses of wholesome action, or he undertakes the 10 courses of unwholesome action: killing living beings, stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, malicious speech, harsh speech, gossip, covetousness, ill will, and wrong view. And so because of undertaking the 10 courses of unwholesome action, whether with pain or pleasure in the present, as a karmic consequence, those 10 courses of unwholesome karma will bring a rebirth in the state of deprivation and an unhappy destination in the lower worlds, even in hell. So those are the ways of undertaking things that are painful now or pleasant now, the next one pleasant now, but they ripen in pain in the future. Okay, the next 2 courses of behavior, the 3rd and 4th, the actual ways of behavior are the same. Abstaining from, or following the 10 courses of wholesome action. Abstaining from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Abstaining from falsehood, divisive speech, harsh speech, idle chatter. Having a mind without covetousness, a mind without ill will, holding right view. In one case, one engages in these 10 types of behavior with pain and with misery. In the second case, one does so with joy and happiness. But both, whether one has pain or pleasure, when one engages in them, one is practicing the 10 ways of wholesome karma. And so when that karma ripens, it will bring pleasure and happiness in the future, rebirth in a happy destination, even in the heavenly world. Okay, then to illustrate each of these ways, the text gives 4 similes, 1 simile for each type of behavior. The first is to illustrate the way that is painful now and results in pain or misery. This is one way that I always think to make a distinction, what was spoken by the Buddha, what was not. But when it comes to these very vivid, very lucid, very striking similes, often I get the sense this has to come from the Buddha himself. I could be wrong about that, but there's something so, say, sparkling and illuminating about the similes that I'm willing to ascribe this directly to the Buddha. So here, this is to illustrate the way which is painful now and results in future pain. There is a bitter gourd with, the juice in this gourd, and it's mixed with poison, and a man comes along who wants to live, not to die, wants pleasure, doesn't want pain, and they tell him this bitter gourd, its juice is mixed with poison, you can drink it. If you do so, you'll find the taste, scent, color disagreeable, and after drinking it, you might die or experience deadly suffering. And so he drinks it, he doesn't reflect, and as he drinks it, he finds it has a bad taste, bad scent, and then he dies or meets with deadly suffering. So that's the way of undertaking things that's painful now and ripens in future pain. The next one, we have a bronze cup with a beverage that has a good color, scent, and taste, and it's mixed with poison. The man comes along, people say to him, this beverage, it has a good color, scent, and taste, but it's mixed with poison. You can drink it if you wish. If you drink it, you'll enjoy the taste, but you might die or meet with deadly suffering. So the man doesn't pay attention to their warning. He drinks it, he enjoys the taste, but later he gets sick and he dies or gets very sick. Okay, third case, this is the way which is painful now, but issues in future happiness. Here there is fermented urine. This is cow's urine, which was in India, it was regarded as a very potent medicine. And it's mixed with various medicines, different herbs. If you don't like the idea of drinking urine, you could think of if any of you have taken Chinese herbal medicine, you know that it usually has a very bitter taste. So a man comes along with jaundice, and they say to him, this fermented urine is mixed with various herbs, herbal medicines. Drink it if you want. When you drink it, you'll find the taste disagreeable. But after you drink it, after some time, you'll get well. And so he drinks, he reflects on these choices, and then he decides to drink it. And as he drinks it, he finds the taste bitter, disagreeable. But after he drinks it, sometime later, he recovers from his illness. So that's the way that is painful now, but ripens in future happiness. Okay, then there's another drink consisting of curd with honey, ghee, and molasses mixed together. And then a man comes along with dysentery, and they tell him, here is this drink. You can drink it. If you drink it, you'll find it very pleasant to taste. It's very agreeable. And after drinking it, you'll recover from your illness. And so he drinks this beverage of curd, honey, and so forth. he enjoys the taste, and after some time, he recovers from his illness. So then the Buddha concludes by saying, again with another simile, he says, just as in autumn, in the last month of the rainy season, maybe this will be like October, when the summer heat has come to an end and the sky is very clear, dark blue, free of clouds, and you see the sun rising above the horizon, dispelling all the darkness as it shines, beams, and radiates. So too, the way of undertaking things that is pleasant now and ripens in the future as pleasure dispels with its beaming, with its shining and beaming and radiance any other doctrines whatsoever of the ordinary recluses and Brahmins. Okay, and that's a quick rundown of Sutta number 46. Okay, any questions or comments on this sutta? Oh, they make a very delicious drink. Yeah. Well, at least it's good. I say that it's a very pleasant drink, very sweet and rich, that it has the medicinal properties of dispelling dysentery that I don't know. Perhaps it does. But there's a kind of sweet that they make in Southeast Asia to offer to monks in the afternoon or evening. Because there are 4 things which are considered allowable in the afternoon. It's oil, usually it's sesame oil, butter, honey, and molasses. Bees, honey, and molasses, or it's a kind of syrup that comes from a palm tree. Or they can use sugar, actual sugar. And then they mix it together and they put them into bottles and they give it to monks. It's just so sweet. I've had it just a few times and I don't really like it. It's too sweet for me. But they call it medicine, but I can imagine that it will be the cause of heart illness and diabetes for many months.
In the 4 ways of undertaking things, there are 2 that lead to a heavenly realms or
Yeah.
There are 2 ways.
There are described 2 of the 4 ways of leading to a good outcome, and in the last paragraph you see that only one of the 2 ways. Is there? Do you have some understanding of a reason for singling that one out as opposed to the other? Seems like more difficult path.
I'd say probably because a positive value is given to pleasure or happiness even here and now. And so, because this way is pleasant now, it's superior to the way which is painful now. But really, I would say that the course which is pleasant now and brings pleasant results, or let's say the choice between the 3rd and 4th, don't depend upon the actual decisions that a person makes about how to behave, but they depend upon a person's intrinsic character, the basic temperament that they bring to their actions. And so that is not really a choice which is open to the person, except perhaps by reflection one can realize the benefits of doing wholesome deeds, and then that will bring joy to the mind as one engages in them. But one thing that's interesting, I thought this was a point you were going to bring up, is that the sutta doesn't mention a course which goes beyond a pleasant rebirth to the stages of enlightenment and liberation. But this would be either of the 2 ways that involve the 10 courses of wholesome action. In Sutta number 41, which we did, I think, last week, the text says, if one wants to, aspires to be reborn in any of these celestial realms, Brahma realms, formless realms, one has to engage in the 10 courses of wholesome action. And if one aspires to reach the liberation of mind without clinging, again one has to engage in the 10 courses of wholesome action. It doesn't actually, the idea of paramis comes after the age of the Nikayas, but it's the 10 courses of wholesome action: avoiding killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, abstaining from false speech, divisive speech, harsh speech. You see them in Sutta 41. Any further questions? Anything new on the internet? Okay, then we'll end now. Today we actually have to give up this space to the group that's downstairs, so we won't have a